If everyone could have a seat, please. We're about to get started. Okay, welcome to the later afternoon portion. Again, appreciate everyone's patience, and we're really excited for the last set of presentations. I know I've heard a lot of excitement so far. I just wanted to talk really briefly because I also have heard that there's a lot of big ideas and some questions about how are we going to pay for all this? That's not what we're talking about right now. But at the same time, I think one important thing about this challenge is that we really are, wanting to spend our time, as staff, as the board, the research advisors, the greater, what we've been calling Resilient by Design family, working closely with teams to come up with plans to actually make these designs once they're finalized a reality. And I think, as Hank mentioned in his talks earlier, 3 years ago, some people came together and said, can we do this in the Bay Area? And I think for a long time, there's these questions like, we don't have any money. How are we going to do this? How are we going to make it happen? And through the work of many people in this room and partnered with the Rockefeller Foundation, here we are today. And so I wanted to really give a shout out to the Rockefeller Foundation for investing in this process and investing in this region to say, can we make this a model that works in communities that don't have a disaster? I think, can we make this investment before we have the $60 billion in devastation that we need to clean up for? And so we really have an opportunity here to show that this works. So that's very exciting. I think we are really going to be thinking carefully and working closely with partners throughout this process to figure out what the different funding mechanisms are. One thing that the Rockefeller Foundation, I think for those of you who were at our launch event in May, Sam Carter from Rockefeller mentioned that Measure AA, the Bay Restoration Measure that was passed in 2016, which is $25 million a year or $500 million for Bay restoration, that the Bay Area was willing to tax ourselves to invest in the Bay, was something that really showed them that this area is serious about taking care of our environment and taking care of our infrastructure. We've now been talking to local funders who look at the Rockefeller Foundation investment and say, that shows that this group is serious about coming up with real solutions that make a difference. So I think it shows me, and I think it shows us, that we really can come together and make this happen, make these designs happen. So we're really excited to see these next 4 teams and then partner with all of these teams in the future to come up with amazing designs based on what they're talking about today, and then also come up with ways to make them a reality. So with that, I'll turn it over to the Hassel Plus team.
Thank you, Amanda. We are the Hassel Plus team. We're a collaboration of practices from Australia, from the Netherlands, and the local Bay Area. We're very excited to be here. And I'll just introduce my colleague David Tickle from Hassel and Natalie DeVries from MVRDV, and I'm Richard Mullane from Hassel. I'll also point out there's a few hundred of our colleagues in Australia and in the Netherlands watching us online, so just keep the applause down, please. Okay, what we aim to do is to bring something of an outsider's view to the Bay and bring some insights from our experiences here on the site and our research. And then from those insights, we're going to introduce a regional concept for the Bay. But then we're going to dive into a local prototype project that we think can really deal with local issues with the community. And then from that prototype, we're going to look at 3 sites where we think it can be applied. So, what are the threats? Well, the threats are pretty significant. Sea level rise is happening. It's clear that it's impacting infrastructure like rail, ports, airports, and water treatment plants. Expensive stuff all along the shoreline, as well as those communities. There's also fluvial flooding, which is increasing in frequency and in devastation along those blue areas in that middle map. And then further to that is seismic risks. So there's fault lines on the ridges that are limiting retreat up the hill for those urban settlements, and there's also liquefaction risks on the shoreline. But is it possible that the real disaster is already underway? And when we tour around the Bay Area, it's clear that a group of cities has grown into this kind of mega region, but it's something of kind of like a mega commuter region. What most people talked about as their shared experience is the time they spend in their cars on their motorways looking at the Bay, which is really sad for us from cultures that really value waterfront places, and that's something we wanted to bring to this process. But also equity. Hasn't been an equitable sharing of that prosperity as the region's grown, and furthermore there's some limitations on the centres of community that used to be a places for people to gather have actually kind of weakened over the years. So the street retail, the libraries, the town centres, they've kind of faded, and that's definitely a problem. Who's greatest impacted by these challenges? Well, we went to a number of vulnerable communities on the shoreline. They're traditionally located on the shoreline because of that engagement with previous industry that's been gone. They don't have access to open space and recreation, and they don't have access to the sorts of community facilities they need to build social resilience. There's also the ambitious Baylands projects and the Bay Trail, which are fantastic, but they're at risk from sea level rise, and also there's something missing in that equation that kind of links those communities to that space on the shoreline. So is there a better model? It's definitely something that we've talked about a lot in this process. There's 101 cities, 9 counties. Is there a way we can turn something that we talk about as a weakness for this region into a strength? Can we use that kind of granular infrastructure of schools and libraries? Can we build on the number of communities, making a network perhaps, rather than complaining about how hard it is to organise everybody through one regional governance model? So we look across the timeline of the Bay, and there's certainly been a fair few disasters in the past. And what's been the biggest asset within those disasters? Have our needs really changed that much since 1906 and just last month? We were really interested to see how communities use spaces and systems every day, but also in disaster. And those systems are sometimes large, but they're sometimes small. They're sometimes movement systems and sometimes information systems, or just sustenance systems. And so when we start developing a concept for the Bay as a region, we start by looking at the existing pattern of development. And the Bay Trail, the Ridge Trail, the transit, freeways and priority development zones are all in loops, and they're vulnerable like a circuit to being broken, as we've heard over and over again. So what we'd like to do is to form points of collection on the waterfront for people to come together, up in the towns and at transit nodes, and up at the ridgeline. And through these points of collection, collect water, collect people, and make them points for disaster response. So we want to join them then with corridors, connectors, as we call them, giving people access to the Bay, engaging them in the conversation about how we respond to these resilience challenges, and then connecting them across to each other. So transitioning from what we call a loop into a network. And we think this is kind of key to resilience. It's key to managing existing water challenges. It's key to managing existing community capacity for resilience. But most of all, it's building a system that is less vulnerable than the current system, which we've seen so often can fail. So we talk about this collect and connect system. we talk about community using it, we talk about the advantages for water management, and we talk about disaster response systems. So we're looking at two scales here. We're looking at a regional platform that can create that network, but we're also looking at this prototype project. And if we dive into the existing condition, these are the types of sites that we're talking about. So we're talking about communities of concern that are on the shoreline, but they're sharing it with infrastructure and industry, and they're very tightly packed in. They're suffering from fluvial flooding along creek lines, but that's often made worse by restoration projects that are bringing rising tides closer to those communities. And they're also often just downhill, from transit nodes and from town centres that were at one time, real centres of community and just need a little bit of help to kind of get back to those valuable systems that they could be. So what we're interested in creating is space. So making room for water, making room for communities, and making room for disaster response. So we're talking about making a series of spaces up the hill in the town and down on the water's edge, connecting them to creek corridors so that they carry water capacity, retention, treatment and reuse, but also connecting them to town centres and to a key street and reviving those places, regenerating them to build that community resilience.
So part of our approach is actually building a digital platform. So we need the communities, because we believe that communities themselves can help to provide programming for these collector spaces. Yes, this is just an example. So we believe actually that the intelligence of the community can produce the programs that we want to gather in our connectors and our collector spaces. There's much talked about already about communities, but I think we think that the intelligence of the communities can be used to create a quality of living. And if we connect this also to all the measurements we are taking to solve issues regarding the possible disasters and sea level rising, we will get a kind of win-win situation. Now you see here in this overview that we think about these elements in different ways. So it's the communities who can provide programs both uphill and downhill in the collectors, but we can also they can also come up with facilities that could even be shared in the whole Bay region, which is the first column. And it's about the communities, but it's also about infrastructure. It's about disaster solution. It's about education. So different levels of connection. And with our platform, we will collect these ideas and programs, and then we can turn the collector areas really also into urban labs. And so the community or communities we're looking for can be sort of the first ones and provide examples and set the tone in the development. So we've been talking about making these connectors, and we always have an uphill and waterside version. So the most important role of the collectors is, of course, making spaces where communities can meet. It's places where we can add programs for education, where we can upgrade transport by making better links to bikes, to bus systems, where local businesses can start to set up some business, where we can make learning centers as well. And during some parts of the year, of course, the collectors really are collecting the water, like they might have been doing on days as today when we have a storm. And there will be retention areas, both above and underground. But around the collectors, there will still be places to do something with water reuse. The ferry will still be accessible because in the flooded areas. There will be floating structures, and it will also be places where you can find excitement and healthy things like markets and playgrounds. And then, of course, the collectors are also an important space because the community will realize that by using the connectors, they can go uphill or downhill to spaces where solutions are in times of disaster. So maybe there will be shelters, there will be information, an escape way if you in times when you can go down to the ferry, because our connections are across of the base systems, which are always circular. So when parts of the infrastructural systems break down, we actually provide ways for people to go up or downhill whenever it's needed. And you can also get information there. And ultimately, of course, also along the public spaces that we can make, along the streets and along the water retention areas, the creeks that are renaturalized. People might also find micro-hubs of information and educational facilities, higher value public spaces, and spaces for community gathering. And ultimately, our idea is, of course, to bring the community back to the bay.
So I'm going to talk through our 3 opportunity projects. As Natalie was saying, really, this idea, this system, this collection of elements, connections, and collection points, we think could be applied in multiple locations. Around 50 or so we've identified, and of course we've focused on 3 in particular. So I'm going to run through why we've selected those, and I guess the starting point of our thinking, because again, it's so critical for us to be thinking about those individual communities and what they would like to see in the future of those places. We're just really making a few suggestions at this point that we would need to work through with those communities. So the 3 opportunity places that we've looked at are South San Francisco, Redwood City, and East Oakland. And what these 3 places have in common, I guess, are some of the challenges that we think are particularly important or urgent. And they are around flooding risk of the foreshore, communities of concern, and often those 2 things overlap. Infrastructure, such as motorways and rail, that block access to the bay, and in turn block the opportunity to open up the bay edge for public use. Uphill transit opportunities, as well as uphill town centres and main streets, which effectively have been through a period of decline. So firstly, looking at South San Francisco, self-proclaimed as the Bay's industrial city. The main street of Grand Avenue runs east-west through this place, westwards into the hillsides, which were once spotted with cemeteries, eastwards to the industrial waterfront, a place which has been undergoing quite interesting change, particularly more recently. So this area has major flood issues. It has a downtown and an identifiable main street, which has gone through some decline over decades, but is undergoing a revitalization program currently. But one of the key issues here is that connection to the waterfront from the main street, particularly with the impact of a few pieces of infrastructure coinciding, rail and motorway in particular. So within our thinking, we see a future, I guess, where that main street and other street connections are revitalized and reconnected to the waterfront. We've expanded space along creek lines, and that's for ecological as well as social program. And thinking about what that program could be, I guess we're thinking about the industrial spaces, how they could be retrofitted or augmented with community program, with more ecological ideas for water treatment and water collection. A resilience learning centre, a focus around education spaces, whether that's formal schools or informal learning spaces. And then thinking about the future of Grand Avenue, the potential for local enterprise, local artists to start filling empty shop fronts, to start occupying blank facades, to embed digital as well as ecological infrastructure within the streetscape itself, and potentially to bring transit back to that important local connector for that community. And then looking at Coleman Creek, where it hits the foreshore, creating a large open space which can be flooded regularly if that's what happens, but then also creating new pedestrian and cycle connectivity, new spaces for learning, whether it's a magnet school or informal outdoor classrooms really based on the ecology and the water functioning of that place. So secondly, Redwood City, claimed to be the oldest city on the peninsula, established, as you can tell by the name, for the forest industry, at that point between the waterfront and all the trees on the hillside. So a critical point in that kind of transfer of the resources onto the water. So again, a place that's highly vulnerable in terms of flooding, a revitalizing downtown area which is disconnected from waterfront because of infrastructure and industry as well. So we would look to build on historic streets, in particular Broadway, which links to the bay itself, being able to unlock greater public space at the bay edge, but also linking into the hillsides, I guess to deliver people to that natural amenity, but also as disaster response. What we've indicated here, as well as in the other locations, as well, is the idea of sending and receiving areas. So the sending area around the downtown, which could be regenerated in some way, the creation of finance, which is then invested in the receiving areas, so creating that new public amenity, new public space and infrastructure. And in terms of some of the program, again, the idea of water, perhaps in this location because of the interesting water temple idea on the hillside. Perhaps there's a modern day interpretation of the water temple. Perhaps a collection of cultural and artistic spaces, which is more relevant to this area. But then also the idea of the waterfront being inhabited by family groups and community groups as well. In the town centre, we're thinking a new station plaza, one that's embedded again with technological and ecological systems, a shoreline park, which extends that water edge connectivity for cyclists and walkers, fields that can flood but can also be used for community sporting events, for picnics, for food-based festivals and other events. Again, bringing people to the waterfront and helping them to engage not only with the water but with each other. And then thirdly, East Oakland, a place that's undergone huge change, particularly social change over the last century. Once had a system of creek lines that have now been altered, somewhat destroyed by infrastructure and industry as well. Again, similar challenges to the other two locations, significant flooding areas, connectivity problems, a lack of open space along the water edge in particular, but also in the upper areas of the hillsides as well. So we see that there's an opportunity for a number of urban connectors from the communities to the waterfront, the opportunity to open up significant areas of open space around that waterfront and to continue some of the connectivity systems that are occurring on the eastern side of the bay, such as the Bay Trail. The programs here, again, very much focused on community need and to be co-designed with the community themselves. We think there's some great opportunities here around food, production, as well as distribution, possibly harking back to the, I guess, the cultural history of that place as the fruit orchards and fields of this area. So spaces along the waterfront where community engagement and greater connectivity for cycling, walking, potentially a new ferry connection linking to the rest of the bay, but then along creek lines as well. Again, some of those food-based, community-based activities and events which could occur. And so we thought we would, I guess, wrap up by talking about, again, this idea that these places can start small. They can be informal, community-led, community-focused. We're really interested in this idea of creating proactive and very optimistic engagement with people to start with temporary, small scale, and then to build to the larger regional scale, and to really think about many of these projects as experimental, innovative, new models of not only creating things, but working with people and different organizations. And looking not only to communities and to government, but to looking at a whole range of other stakeholders and participants in the process, particularly thinking about where funding sources may be through FEMA, through Caltrains, through water infrastructure and disaster relief funding, which could be unlocked and redirected towards, I guess, more of a community outcome as well. So ultimately building that idea of this network of communities that are brought together by this idea of connecting and collecting people. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll just give people a chance to kind of slip in or out if you need to while we get ready for the next team to come up, which is the home team. So come on up. Yeah, we'll just give people a second to run in and out. But you can just get started whenever you're ready.
So hello, I'm Deb Gunther at Mithun, the home team, and I'm here with Tim Millett-Parks and Hillary Knoll, also from Mithun. We really appreciated the feedback 2 weeks ago. We're really looking forward to the open house this evening, having a lot of conversations with the community, something we're really looking forward to. I want to acknowledge our team, but I also want to acknowledge this amazing experience and raise up the idea that all of us have teams that are quite diverse and quite a variety of disciplines, and that's not always the case. And a critical role I think that we can all play when we go out into the typical market project is to continue to raise up the idea of how important it is to bring these resilient ideas to projects with this really wide range of disciplines. So our team includes Integral Group, HR&A Advisors for Economics, the Chinatown Community Development Corporation, Alta Planning and Design, doing bike planning and mobility, the Resilient Design Institute, Moffitt Nichols Coastal Engineers, and Urban Biofilters doing prototyping, and Biohabitats, who also, they're amazing ecologists, also doing really great wastewater work. And Streetwise, who we're working with on a health impact assessment in Denver, and Antwi and his team, Antwi Acombe, are actually at the City of Oakland right now talking about resilience planning, so they couldn't be here with us. But we're excited to have them on the team. So Tim's going to start us off with a story, and then we're going to actually play our video. It's about an 8-minute video, and I have to do a shout out to Graham, Katie, and Sandy, who are here in the room, and then Jason and Logan, who are listening online, who really poured their heart and soul into this video and the project. And then Hillary is going to wrap up by summarizing our main direction.
So I'm just going to start with a sort of quick personal anecdote that kind of goes back to when we first started talking about our team's approach to this work. We tried to think, as a team, what had defined home for us as individuals sort of throughout our lives, what had helped us understand where we were from. And one of the personal stories that emerged actually had a real sort of connection to infrastructure, and it was the Rural Electric Cooperative in my hometown. It was called the Big Sandy, RECC. Big Sandy was the river that ran through the area. It was the name of the watershed where all the co-op members lived. And so through the name of that infrastructure, it gave us a sense of a connection to a larger region and an ecology that was not just our hometown or our local school. And it was a kind of nuanced way of understanding place and who your neighbors were. These co-ops also meant being able to afford your house payment in some cases because your power bill was affordable. This is my grandfather's membership certificate. He bought in for $10 in the 1950s, and now he's fully vested, and he gets a rebate check every month instead of a bill. And these weren't uncommon in many of these communities. These co-ops were a source of local pride and job training, local employment. And in the 3 design opportunities that we want to share with you today, some of the attributes of these co-ops are brought forward. Affordability, local ownership, shared wealth, a focus on vulnerable populations, and uniting communities throughout their watershed, providing a broader understanding of home as a part of a complex and beautiful ecology. And so just with that in mind, we are going to play our video. We began this process by asking questions. What is home? What are the boundaries of home? What are the places we love? What will our home look like in the future? The Bay Area is in crisis. When large groups of our neighbors can't afford to live in their homes, then the model for living in the Bay is broken for all of us. Many of our most vulnerable communities, those enduring poverty and structural racism, also live in areas that are highly susceptible to sea level rise and flooding. We need solutions that allow neighborhoods to remain in place and thrive. We must produce more housing, preserve low-income housing, and protect residents from displacement, while improving the quality of neighborhoods for everyone. The Home Team proposes the creation of priority resilience areas where new ideas of home emerge from a healthy and dynamic Bay ecosystem. New regional patterns along the Bay Edge intertwine the health of the Bay and the health of our neighbors. Working in partnership with community members, we will use design as research to take on challenges and create opportunities for communities to relate, adapt, and thrive. North Richmond is a place of historic racial inequity. African Americans who arrived in the Bay for the World War II shipbuilding effort were forced to settle in the low-lying area, cut off from other communities by railroads and infrastructure. Communities well organized, developing a North Richmond vision plan, programs at the Verde School, and greening projects with urban tilth. Green infrastructure and floating trails can address flooding while enhancing quality of life. By improving walkability and bikeability to BART and the ferry terminal, residents can reduce commute times to re-engage with Bay nature at Point Malate as part of a daily routine. Horizontal levees and improvements to wastewater infrastructure open up opportunities to build new, permanently affordable housing. The community and the ecosystem will thrive, catalyzed by an urban ecology business incubator that is a source of jobs, innovative housing, and a clean energy park on the site of the former landfill. In the near term, the North Richmond Water Reclamation Plant can provide treatment with constructed wetlands, allowing for pocket marsh connections that are healthier for the Bay Edge. As waters rise, the constructed wetlands transition to salt marshes to augment the Bay's estuarine habitat. Looking 20 years out, decentralized wastewater systems can be located in each neighborhood. These wastewater systems look like greenhouses open to the public. They can also process increased nutrients and return clean water to the Bay. As infrastructure is relocated to inland conditions, the waterfront is freed up for new floating housing and ecological restoration. Students from Kennedy High School in Richmond have shared visions of healthy food, floating homes, rooftop gardens, and multimodal transport. Stacking funding sources for ecology, wastewater, and health can support this neighborhood transformation, a priority resilience area in North Richmond. Marin City residents are well organized and tight-knit, yet constant flooding and deep health disparity highlight inequity within one of the nation's most affluent counties. Improvements to Highway 101 can mitigate its regular flooding and catalyze positive change in Marin City. However, it is essential that the existing residents not be displaced. People here have experience with things not working out in their favor. New economic models need to come first for producing, protecting, and preserving housing. We propose elevating the low-lying portion of Highway 101 to provide a critical second access point to Marin City. A new horizontal levee and marsh areas will adapt to rising water while supporting new affordable houseboat cooperatives. Proposed creek restoration and street retrofits with green infrastructure will help reduce upland flooding. The community thrives as new housing and jobs come to Marin City, and a community reinvestment fund directs revenue to support projects with community benefit, such as an enhanced community center and a community-owned clean energy microgrid. In the short term, the highway median can be redesigned for flood control and provide an immediate response. A raised bay trail can be designed to be part of a new horizontal levee that phases into tidal marsh as sea level rises. In 20 years, an elevated Highway 101 and a reconfigured shoreline support development of a new mixed-use center, providing jobs, healthy food, and permanently supported affordable housing along a living shoreline, with houseboats and a new expanded tidal marsh. Residents, hikers, bikers, and tourists use new trails and floating bridges to move easily between Sausalito, Tam Valley, and Marin City. Resilience investments are a catalyst that can include many co-benefits, such as space for a flea market every Saturday in a new floating town square in this priority resilience area in Marin City. The neighborhoods in East Oakland have motivated community organizers with adopted master plans for San Leandro Creek and Arroyo Viejo and a strong citywide resilience plan. But the challenges of racial inequity are clear. Between 2003 and 2013, a young black man in Oakland was as likely to be killed in gun violence as he was to be prepped for college. Our team is committed to a process that recognizes the urgency in that disparity. When we walked Arrowhead Marsh with the community members, we heard that they would like to use the park more, but getting there was frustrating and unpleasant. Trails along the creeks can connect people to Lake Chabot and the Pacific Crest Trail along the new East Bay Greenway, making it easy to be healthy with places to walk, bike, or visit with family and friends. Adaptation can occur as the Bay Edge is restored, with transfer of development rights and community land trusts supporting development of permanently affordable housing for a mix of incomes, including the missing middle, in mixed-use neighborhoods that include local jobs and access to healthy food. A community-based clean energy microgrid, a decentralized wastewater system, and transit accessibility could contribute to more inclusive neighborhoods with shared wealth building. A 20-year vision includes a horizontal levee along the 880 freeway, protecting that essential transportation asset while creating a valuable site for mixed-use, mixed-income housing that supports estuarine life with muted marshes behind the levee. From day one, the trail system can be the framework for mitigating upland flooding with rainwater collection along the creek, in neighborhoods, and along arterials to slow flooding. Opportunities to daylight creeks can be combined with new housing that supports a thriving riparian ecosystem. Investments to improve the site ecology will be made to maximize community benefit while catalyzing development of new, healthy, mixed-income housing in this prime transit-accessible priority resilience area in East Oakland. No one is better at defining and mapping assets and liabilities than community members themselves. The Streetwise app will be an important tool for residents to highlight strengths and barriers from their perspective. Our work with the community will also include prototyping, the piloting of community-driven ideas initiated at relatively low cost, developed in partnership with educational institutions, and can jumpstart the transformations. We look forward to working with the neighbors to hear the stories, understand the hopes, and collaborate on design that strengthens the foundations of home.
All right. So through this collaborative research process, it's been so rich over the last several months. Our team has gained such a deeper understanding of the broad scale and the multifaceted capacity to the challenges ahead of us, and really put the work we do in urban design and sustainability in a much deeper and more grounded context. And like so many of the other teams, we engaged in a very involved mapping process, which revealed a series of kind of critical hotspots as we saw them. And shown here on this map is an outline of some of the potential of these priority resilience areas. We see the need for interdependent and bioregional based solutions that address these regional connections, but ultimately happen at a local scale. And the question we ask continually is, what is that scale, and what's the sort of sweet spot between the local neighborhood and the region? And we feel it is this creek shed. So shown on the map there are probably 18 to 20 or so sites where there's high potential for replicability among these new, what we're calling the priority resilience areas. And the method for establishing these, we see one pathway could be a reevaluation of priority conservation and priority development areas, and really rethinking how those have been developed, and adding that there should be new criteria. Some of that is obviously effects of climate change, but also legacy of environmental injustice, the watershed health and ecosystem, those critical infrastructure leverage points, and the community development need. And these PRAs will focus resources, potentially, into a sort of testing ground and demonstration projects, which would be highly replicable. And taking it a bit further, the strategy of relate really pertains up to connections across boundaries. So this is transit and pathways. And the strategy of adapt pertains to new land use patterns, including home interwoven with ecology. And the design strategy of thrive is really about equitable business models, so new land trusts and cooperatively owned district systems. Key for our team, and so many have spoken about it today, is that we must start at these communities who are most vulnerable, and not just because it's the right thing to do, but because there's a really fascinating sort of overlay of lever points as we see them that could become the catalysts for broader change across these PRAs. And this investment opportunity is a chance to look at problems and positing that they are actually the points of the solution. So often the barrier that's the freeway or the raised divided highway or the polluting refinery plant can be reimagined on that site in that community for direct community benefit. And we see this healing gesture of sort of subverting the legacy of environmental injustice as really critical. And we heard this echoed by the North Richmond students when we brought them to our office to do some design workshops. They were most excited about some of the green streets and ideas of growing food on vacant lots, reimagining the adjacent refinery into clean energy in their backyard. And we see this home opportunity as a way to really elevate the best practice in the housing industry. Spur and other groups constantly talk about the preservation of existing affordable deed-restricted units, the protection from gentrification and displacement, and then produce more housing so that we can build our way out of this immense deficit in the area, in the Bay Area. But it's also to sort of couple that with how are we building and what exactly does that housing look like, and what are the new forms that have yet to be really market tested? Additionally, these need to be redesigned with nature, regenerating with whole systems, and reweaving hybrid ecologies. Ultimately, this is for us about adapting in place and ensuring that the dynamic, changing cities, which are always happening around us very quickly, don't lose a sense of home and a sense of place as this occurs. The habitat and habitation matrix that we developed really as a generative tool became so much more, and that home is the true synthesis of these two. It's the blending of creation of habitat for other species alongside with our own human habitation needs. And we're really excited to get into the details of what some of this looks like, thinking of floating housing pier structures which double as reef and biomimicry habitat for critical indicator species in those particular ecosystem districts. And ultimately, the process is going to be long and hard, and it has to include capacity building among agency building among stakeholders and the community itself that we're working with. We're talking about 3 years, 20 years, and 100 years. So we know that the process is as important as the outcome going forward. With that, we're really optimistic. We see just so much wealth of ideas and opportunities and stacking of co-benefits going forward. And thank you to all of the stakeholders through this process who have brought so much to the table. We're truly standing on the shoulders of giants to move this forward. We look forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks. Now I think we'll just take a couple minutes if people need to stretch, not a full break, but I've noticed there's been some wrestling around and moving, and so just about 5 minutes or so if you need to check your phone or charge your phone or whatever you need to do, but don't go too far. We're going to get started shortly. Touch your toes, do a jumping jack. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, we're gonna get started. So if you guys can take your seats, we're just gonna. We have 2 more presentations. So and then afterwards, as you know, there's a public open house. So just a little bit more logistics. We're gonna clear the chairs out of this room. So we're going to be able to spread the boards out a little bit more as people can come through. So we're asking teams to be by your boards because people have questions. We also have some comment cards that people can write comments down and submit them into a comment box. We'll have, as we wrap up these presentations, we're also going to have a cash bar open as soon as we're done. So don't worry. even though I see that Stephen doesn't have a cocktail shaker this time, so. Right, oh yeah. Okay, All Bay Collective.
All right, good afternoon. I'm Stephen Engblom with AECOM, and these are my teammates, Dr. Christina Hill from UC Berkeley, Chris Guillard from CMG, and Jeanette Kim from California College of the Arts. And together we are here to represent the All Bay Collective. We formed this team because of our respect for each other's work in the area and globally. We also were really committed to this idea of intergenerational learning, and all during this phase one we've been running 3 courses at UC Berkeley and CCA, and it's been an incredible iterative exchange of knowledge between disciplines and between generations, and a lot of the work has been generated by an exchange between the professionals and the students, and really all in service of us developing these ideas that are going to make the San Francisco Bay more resilient. So, how can we really, when we started this process, I really liked Hank's comments right after lunch about, we're not here about the sort of easy ideas. And so we made a comment in our first video that we want to build on the knowledge that we already have and ask questions that haven't been asked yet and develop research. So in those studios with the students, exchanging maps from our professional teams that have been developed in service of real projects, there's been some really innovative new ideas. So in addition to asking questions that have already been asked, like, how do we restore and adapt the ecologies, we need to ask, what are we going to do when the sea level rises and the ground flooding is higher and creating new ecologies? So that puts extra pressure on that question. And then the question of how can all of us continue to afford to live here? What do we do when we have 30% more people living here and welcoming more people to join us? And yes, we need to make our infrastructure more resilient to sea level rise and seismic activity. But how do we go beyond that to think about infrastructure as a way to catalyze new jobs and new housing in our most vulnerable communities? And as I said, how can we do this together between teachers and students, professionals, and the communities? All of these questions, we want to sort of dig deeper on those. And as part of the phase one touring and meeting with the experts, we heard some amazing quotes along the way that really, as we have our work sessions, we keep coming back to a couple of big ideas that, there is no shoreline, rather a shore zone. And we're a low-income community, and so the sort of really sad irony of it is that it's not our water, but it's flooding our homes. Those are really incredibly compelling ideas that have really stuck with us and really keep coming back to those. So, what do we do with those? And we have been working in the studios and in the offices, in these in the neighborhoods. Ultimately, though, we think it's not going to be any one profession, not any one community, nor any one generation that will solve these challenges. So what we really believe that is at stake here is, or the really big opportunity is to create a new way of thinking about our relationship with the Bay. That can inspire everybody to get involved. And so that led us to an idea. There's a lot of complexity to all of these issues. And at 4 o'clock today, you've listened to a lot of presentations. And so I want to try something here we've been excited about, sort of how do you simplify this down into an idea that can get everybody excited? And so let me give that a try. So for thousands of years, we've been defining cities by lines. We've been defining and defending the edges between the city and nature, between wet and dry, between inside and outside, between the invested in and the neglected. This is very stressful. It's stressing us out. This is what all of these presentations are about. So we like the idea of going from the stress of living on the edge to actually just pulling that edge apart and jumping in. And trying to live in that uncomfortable answer of there is no sea level rise number, but rather we have to plan to a range of numbers. And there is no shoreline, it's a shore zone. All of that gets us excited. So how do you live in the edge? What we're saying is that in a time of sea level rising, groundwater flood rising, we need to expand the edge of the bay to include both habitat and housing for ecology and people living side by side. And we've asked ourselves how we can rethink the bay edge as a place where people and nature can coexist. And then the second big idea is that in the 20th century in particular, we built these corridors to get us as fast as possible from point A to point B, and it ripped apart communities. And what we want to do is really rethink that and say to ourselves that right now we have got a huge challenge because all of those corridors have to be elevated and protected from flooding and seismic activities, and also modernized to accommodate new technologies. So this is our once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to really rethink those as a generator of jobs and housing, as a way to pull those communities together. So we call that big idea resilient corridors. So the first idea was tidal cities. Second one is resilient corridors. And then thirdly, it's an issue of, we've heard a lot about this from different groups today, but our take on it is that it's a governance issue. And these natural and man-made crises don't respect the fact that we call one area a town and the other one a city, or these municipal boundaries. So we and our policies do. So we need to think about new alliances among existing agencies and new partnerships between community advocates and the residents and the stakeholders so that we can leapfrog these jurisdictional boundaries. And we call this idea resilient equity hubs. Now, all three of these are big, important ideas independently, but we really believe that the real magic happens when we overlay them, and that's when we can transform our relationship to the Bay Edge and create some new, amazing ways to stay and live in that edge rather than retreat or wall ourselves off from it. Christina.
So what I'm going to introduce is the first of those ideas. And as Stephen said, we were trying to figure out how to combine the research that we had into some new ideas. We've been in the region looking at problems like this one. This happens to be the pump house in East Palo Alto, which is pumping groundwater every day, whether it rains or not. And we know that groundwater is going to be a big issue. We don't have a network of pumps that manage that for us. This is the exception, not the rule. So we're not ready for a higher water table. And we need to think about what that means. So the research my group was doing at UC Berkeley was to map where is there a shallow water table in the Bay Area, and I'll talk a little bit more about why, but this blue area on this map shows where the water table is within 6 feet of the surface, and that means that everywhere where the sea level rises 6 feet, all those blue areas would be emergent groundwater. So that's a very serious problem, would fill our pipes underground, would expose buildings to mold, could heave foundations. This is a very big deal in a region that hasn't had to manage this in the past. And it also increases our liquefaction risks. So in a seismic region, it's even more important that we understand how to deal with high water table zones. So we looked for examples. We looked at Amsterdam. We saw floating architecture. We thought, okay, this is something that we could potentially use here in an innovative and different way, but using some of the same proven technologies. And the problem is, as I'm going to show in these couple sections, that as the sea level rises, and that dark blue is salt water and the light blue is fresh water, we're going to see that light blue freshwater rise and eventually emerge on the land, even if we build levees and walls. So East Palo Alto has a good levee, still has groundwater flooding problems, doesn't affect it. So we need to figure out something that will allow us to do that. And one of the oldest ideas in landscape architecture is to dig hole and make mound. And if we do that, we can balance our cut and fill locally and use the reshaping of the land as the primary strategy for how we continue to occupy these wet zones. We can build a wider living edge and at the same time use back bay lagoons, ponds, as a way to manage water flowing off the land, manage stormwater, manage creek flooding, improve water quality before it hits the bay, and create value, because it's hard to see here, but we would actually propose putting floating housing, stacked prefabricated units, shared decking, Dutch style, in these back bay lagoons to create value and maintain value, because conventional architecture will fail, and that'll cause displacement. So we have to find a way to continue to occupy these places to adapt in place. And we can roll back with this strategy. We can use a new hole and a new mound to fill the old pond and move back to higher ground if sea level rise goes beyond 6 feet. So we're trying to use a new problem to come up with a new solution. And that illustration here in the bird's eye shows how a tributary might come through this band of tidal cities. And we call it tidal cities because they're actually meant to hold the high tide with a series of gates and mute the tidal fluctuation. So you don't have to go up and down 6 feet every day, twice a day, but you can actually put floating structures on something that might fluctuate maybe 2 feet. And then we think that these strategies for managing water will actually be vibrant urban districts, someplace where not only can I live in one of those units, but I'm also doing a favor for the people around me because I'm holding their stormwater. So I'm living in infrastructure that protects my neighborhood. And we think that's a good deal. So with that, I'll hand it over to Chris, who's going to talk about how we would connect ourselves within this wetter shore zone.
All right. Tidal cities is an exciting vision for how we can truly live in the edge. Resilient corridors is really about how we link the edge. It's about how we create connectivity and stay connected in an uncertain future, but also, and more importantly, how we create win-win solutions in a time of certain change. So we all know that our existing transportation systems are already stressed and at capacity. That's obvious. Even without these new stressors, we have to do something. We also know that in many locations, our corridors are already vulnerable to tidal and storm-related flooding, and that in many locations, our corridors divide communities and sever important ecological connections between upland and bay. And so these issues will surely be exacerbated by climate change and population growth looking forward. In this simplified map, we've illustrated the level of impact of 6 feet of sea level rise on the transportation corridors that ring the bay and how they disconnect the various tributaries that flow from the highlands. And based on our analysis, we've identified that there's around 80 miles of highway that will be impacted at this stage, not to mention rail corridors and tributary streets that provide access to the highways. So as we look forward and envision a more resilient Bay Area, we do have this incredible opportunity, if not an imperative, to rethink and adapt these corridors, to anticipate new transportation technologies and modes of transportation, to create and build new multi-purpose infrastructures that address sea level rise, seismic, and flood risk together, and importantly, reconnect our riparian corridors for greater social and ecological movement. So what if we expanded our tributary corridors, elevated freeways, and constructed, or highway mobility corridors, and constructed them in a new and more resilient way to allow for greater movement of flora, fauna, people, and water? Put the corridors and tunnels in select locations to create the back edge of a horizontal levee and protect inland communities. Or utilize the air rates of the corridors in select locations for transit-oriented development that can connect communities and in turn provide new points of access to communities that currently don't have it. Raise the corridors in select locations where we need to address sea level rise, but also take advantage of those situations to create bayside habitat. And lastly, and I think really importantly, create new corridors that fringe and connect across the bay while setting the stage for restored wetlands and wetland migration. So the challenge, of course, and it's a complex one, is how do we stitch all of these ideas together while maintaining existing connectivity? We know that these corridors are incredible assets, and the question is how we work within them to rethink them. This is, I think, a particularly compelling example of how we might do that on the 880 corridor around the Oakland Coliseum. And so just taking a closer look at that, what it might be like at the intersection of an expanded riparian corridor, a new transportation corridor, and shore zone improvements. So what all of these really point to is this nexus between regional resilience and local opportunity and communities. And it also points out this clear fact that in order for us to be successful, we need to find new ways to share and collaborate across disciplines, across jurisdictions, and within our communities.
Great. So our third idea is called Resilience Equity Hubs and focuses on governance and social equity. This map is hard to read precisely because it shows the tangle of jurisdictions, political jurisdictions that we have overlaid with watersheds. Maps like these remind us that natural hazards don't follow political boundaries, and yet because we make plans and budgets within these structures, we often lack capacity to address the scale and complexity of climate risk. The issue here isn't any lack of public institutions. We have 9 counties, 101 cities, and scores of PDAs and PCAs. Nor is our only challenge a lack of will or resources. Though the cost of adaptation is daunting, we also have an extraordinary opportunity to harness the economic wealth of the Bay Area, the mandate created by Measure AA, and really the resourcefulness of local communities. So instead, we believe that one of our biggest challenges is a shortage of viable mechanisms for coordination. So in response, we created a toolkit of governance and financial mechanisms that can connect to design strategies at multiple scales. For example, this could include the Geological Hazard Abatement District or a transfer of development rights to fund public infrastructure in a way that could relate to local crowdfunding campaigns. At the scale of the neighborhood, REBS could also create an incremental change as a process stewarded by local partners. So phase 1, for example, could identify where a high groundwater table overlaps with vacant or government-owned sites. Phase 2 could build the tidal city approach that Christina just described, bringing in higher density, affordable housing within these sites. And then phase 3 would really start to work across property lines, forming cooperative ownership models such as co-housing or community land trusts. And spatially, this can create a kind of adjacency across diverse landscapes, using ponds in one location to alleviate groundwater pressure in others, or storing water from a kind of network of green streets. And then phase 4 could really scale this up and realize the resilient corridor ideas that Chris just described. At the scale of a few city blocks, we could see this through the way that district heating or gray water recycling could connect new and old houses. Cooperative ownership could provide intergenerational care that can allow a single parent to go to work, as well as things like barbecues and tool libraries that could build social resilience among neighbors. All right, so the 3 ideas we've just presented complement each other. Through tidal cities, we live with water. Through resilient corridors, we stay connected. And through REBS, we make change possible for all of us. We've identified sites where there's a strong overlap between groundwater risk, transit vulnerability, and under-resourced communities. And this led us to San Rafael Bay, San Leandro Bay at the Oakland Coliseum, and East Palo Alto Baylands. Each of these places brings together a complex mosaic of cultural and ecological vitality, and we're really excited about the possibility of creating a new kind of resilience hub with these communities. So let's start with East Palo Alto Baylands, where sea level rise affects the very fabric of one of the last affordable cities in Silicon Valley. Though EPA is protected by levees and a healthy tidal water wetland, it's also vulnerable to flooding, which you can see in the dotted line, and groundwater inundation, which you can see in the blue dots. To address these issues, we've identified places where these 3 ideas can make the biggest difference. So tidal cities can bring about adaptive change to groundwater flooding. In green, public transit could start to reactivate the Dumbarton Corridor or ferry service at Cooley Landing. And then in orange, REB tools could fund projects like this, maybe coordinating efforts with the San Francisco Joint Power Authority. San Rafael residents too face significant challenges and opportunities and are really uniquely perched on an edge. San Rafael's downtown is built on tidal marshes and is vulnerable to flooding, groundwater inundation, and liquefaction. So in response, we've identified places in which a much more adaptive approach can protect from both rising tides and rising rents, and basically kind of connect back into habitats, job centers, and neighborhoods. Lastly, at Sandlander Bay and the Oakland Coliseum, you can see a real confluence of these questions, from Arrowhead Marsh to the Coliseum, and then across the BART tracks to the International Boulevard. And you know, as the sports teams move out, this site will change. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to activate this public land, industry, logistics, transportation infrastructure that are all concentrated here, and to do so all in a way that residents can benefit from this wealth of resources. We heard about residents' sense of disconnection from jobs and the waterfront here, and as the site changes, it's just really important to get this right. So then our approach was to look for interdependencies across the San Leandro Bay area in a way that can connect tributaries fully to the bay, to use the Oakland Coliseum site as a pilot site for this high-density tidal development, and start to link these neighborhoods. So by drawing resources into communities, we can build on community advocacy that's happening today with a long-term vision for the future. And Stephen will wrap up with that in mind.
Okay, so I know we're out of time, but we have 2 steps really. First step is to really partner with the community organizations so that I really like the idea in one of the previous teams about educating. We're really about our partner, Miranda Mopin from SKIO, has a lot of experience at creating these experience-based learning that empower the communities. And step 2 is to embed into this process tools that all of us have created for very important public projects that are already things like games of tide, triple bottom line analysis, and a social equity checklist that we've already worked with some of the experts on in the community. So that would form the basis of our partnership with, to co-create these projects. So with that, thank you very much, and that's it.
Okay, so we are getting to our last presentation. I will ask everyone to silence your cell phone if you have not done that already. If we could just take a few minutes, anyone who needs to leave, please leave now instead of going in and out. You should stay. But I do, I know we've been sitting here for a long time, but we do want to give our final presentation the same attention that we've given other presentations. So if you need to be out for any reason, go ahead and do that now, and we're going to try and not have people come in and out during the presentation. So just want to make sure that we're all ready to go. And then we'll invite our Big+ONE+Sherwood team up to the podium. Yeah, you guys are, come on. Also, if anyone who's standing in the back wants to sit down, there are seats still available in the audience.
Maybe you do it. Huh? Let me just put it there just in case.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Jeremy Siegel with Bjarke Ingels Group. I'm joined by my colleagues Matthijs Bouw with One Architecture and Brice Sarte with Sherwood. We are joined by a larger team of transportation, economics, and coastal engineering experts, and many of them are in the audience. And as always, we're really excited to be here and being able to think about the future of this region with you all. For us, the Bay is a really kind of incredible place because it is emblematic of this dynamic that exists in many cities around the world. It's a place that has an incredible natural richness and resource, and that is why people have kind of flocked here for centuries to take advantage of those resources. And at the same time, that occupation is the very thing that threatens it. So if you look from early settlement, Native American, to a series of towns during the gold rush, the Bay has just kind of been expanding sequentially to to the point that now it really works as one region, but at a scale that is sort of disproportionate to any means to control it. And it's that kind of sprawl and development pattern that has led to the urban challenges that we know today, from transit and congestion to housing, lack of affordable housing and displacement that results, strained infrastructure bringing flows from far away, ecological decline along the bay's edge. And those development patterns and the kind of emissions and all the lifestyle associated with it have also been in part responsible for the climate stresses that the bay feels today. From sea level rise and storm flooding to drought and wildfires to earthquakes and liquefaction. And so our approach to the bay has been that climate stresses and urban stresses are really one. And in order to build a more resilient bay, we need to work on both equally. Simply put, to become more resilient, sustainable, and equitable, and to deal with some of these challenges, the bay needs to link its natural systems to its urban systems in a better way. It needs better transit. It needs more housing in the right places. And it needs to modernize and decentralize its infrastructure to build resiliency. We're also cognizant of the way that things are done in the Bay Area, which is also a kind of a symptom of many cities, certainly in this country, that the kind of silos of city making really don't talk to one another. I think the Bay in particular, you see ecological discussions completely separated from urban discussions. Transit works on kind of its own logic, infrastructure, and people all kind of work separately. So simply put, our proposal is that we need to think of all of these elements together as one, what we call a social ecosystem, where ecological planning provides a framework for growth, where transit responds to growth rather than the other way around, or rather growth responds to transit rather than the other way around. Where all the kind of incredible ingenuity and resources of the people of the Bay work to develop these systems, and where infrastructure is decentralized and localized into community. So if this is the Bay today, we've developed a series of proposals at a regional scale. These proposals all kind of find a place geographically as a framework, beginning with the kind of creek system that once really defined the Bay, that's been culverted and tunneled over years and sprawled around. Can these creeks become a new kind of framework for the Bay, allowing for an increment for sea level rise adaptation and kind of a new unit of community? Can we peel back decades of paved over surfaces in the uplands, allowing for better recharge of the groundwater and fighting drought? Can we use the assets that the Bay has to build better transit rather than building new kind of shiny infrastructure? Can we use our roads, use the Bay itself, use our trails, and better connect things in a more flexible way? And can we rediscover the edge of the Bay, both as a place for ecology, but also as a place for people? So we've looked at 3 design opportunities, and to give you a little bit of a sense of our process, we'll start with the first one up at the Golden Gate. Given that kind of the initial frame for this competition was sea level rise, and it is one of the more acute risks in the area, we were curious about the kind of dynamic between local adaptation, which we think can and should take place in order to adapt to sea level rise. It might happen in different ways in different parts of the Bay. But we also know that there's a lot of uncertainty about the extent of sea level rise and the kind of numbers we're going to be dealing with in the future. So we were interested in looking at a kind of regional strategy that would take a component of this risk, tidal, kind of annual king tides and storm surge, and deal with it on a regional level. We looked at the kind of difference between 500 miles of investment in levees to keep up with potentially extreme height, and also a series of locations for tidal barriers, including the Dumbarton Bridge, the Bay Bridge. And then we looked at the Golden Gate Strait itself, the location of the BCDC competition several years back. And we developed kind of an alternative proposal for this area, which would build on the 7-mile crescent of shoals, which is left by a sediment deposit coming out of the bay, And basically at about 30% of the same material that it would take to build a barrier in the deep kind of prism there, about 7 million cubic yards of fill, you could create a barrier that would take care of those more extreme levels of sea rise and tidal inundation while allowing for maritime traffic and so on. So this is something that we think is interesting. It's something that we think should be looked at, but we also kind of focused our attention on a series of other sites at a more local scale, starting with Islayas Creek.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. I will do my best to see the screen at this angle. Well done. Bree Sarte with Sherwood Design Engineers. And Islayas Creek is, I think, a really important site that's been at the center of a lot of the industrial activity in San Francisco, and is also the site of one of the original ecological and wetland systems that no longer exist in any serious scale in San Francisco. In particular, this part of San Francisco was culverted and put into creeks at the formation of the city and the development of the southeast part of San Francisco. The need for the expansion of freeways and circulation infrastructure has added additional layers on top of Islayas Creek for circulation and transportation. And beyond that, are you seeing a black screen or, yeah, so. And beyond that, this has become a hub for a lot of the maritime activity and port activity on the waterfront, which has changed in nature and scale over time, but still has a deep water harbor and significant productive use, including providing a number of jobs, which we've heard from people living in the neighborhood are extremely important to preserve in that location. It is a very challenged part of the city from a sea level rise and flooding perspective, not just at the waterfront, but all the way up to the top of the ridge near Twin Peaks, where in this watershed basin there is flooding very often that creates a combined sewer flood condition in a number of parts of the neighborhood. So our proposal would start to address that, and in particular, much of the industrial land that is in purple in this slide is positioned in what was historically marshland in this part of San Francisco. Here we've overlaid the major two freeways that run through this neighborhood that effectively connect or pass over the two residential communities of the Dog Patch and the Bayview, Dog Patch to the north and Bayview to the south. So we see this part of the city as an incredible opportunity. It's one that the city has put forward as a design opportunity for us to consider. And so we've taken a really bold approach, we believe, to say what could be possible here. It started with listening to people in the neighborhood, to touring all the different sites with many of you. And our proposal starts with an idea that really says, could this be a place where San Francisco creates a 300-acre restored wetland and riparian system as part of a restored marsh? Could we take what is now a small inlet that once was one of our most important creekways and really restore it substantially to the south and to the west? And take advantage of a rare, if not the only, last opportunity in San Francisco to really think about managing stormwater and floodwater in a different way. There are proposals that we have in San Francisco to contain the 1 in 5 year storm. That's the minimum and maximum level of service that the infrastructure is meant to contain. So what happens to the 6-year and 100-year and 500-year storm? We think there's a great opportunity to do something substantial and ecological in this part of San Francisco. And to take the existing channel and to transform the southern side, to take some of that 300 acres of industrial land to create vertical industrial development opportunities for a net positive increase in the density and development of this neighborhood to provide more jobs than there are today, but in a more compact location that allows for the ecology of this to come closer to its original form. So you can start to see this evolution that might actually be facilitated by moving some of the heavy industrial uses potentially to a new series of barges or a reconfiguration of Brisbane Bay to the south, and potentially even relocating parts, if not the entirety, of the wastewater treatment plant that is currently adjacent to the Bayview neighborhood. So we don't have all of the answers in the sequencing to this, but we have a good idea of the process today and the potential evolution to more ecologically integrated means of managing and processing wastewater at this massive facility that today takes 80% of the city's wastewater. Could that start to be thought about differently? We think so as part of our proposal. And I think Jeremy is going to continue with a couple more ideas.
Sure. So this gives you a sense of the resource recovery park and plant on the edge that Bree just talked about. Click. All right. So what all of these infrastructural improvements do is provide a frame for resilient growth. And as Bree said, what we heard loud and clear from the community when we visited was that the kind of industrial jobs that are in the neighborhood should not just be protected, but they should be increased. So what we propose is a densification of industry, logistics connected to the Deepwater Port, maintaining this area as a critical node for San Francisco to its south, and taking this kind of low-rise industrial area that sits in the floodplain and really densifying it. We also see opportunities to connect. I-280 has been contemplated for a long time, this spur that juts off of the 101 and runs north for a decommission and potential demolish. And for us, the cost of demolishing it might actually be better spent to enhance it, not as a machine for cars, but rather as a machine for light mobility, for pedestrian connectivity, with spurs reaching into the neighborhood. This Lace Creek in the background. So from a gray, kind of tunnelized, culverted creek, disconnected along the transect, to an activated, natural, and also industrial heart for Bayview. And we also see this really as no small plan. If San Francisco itself has Golden Gate, which serves a huge area around it, there's really a lack of this kind of open space in this part of the city. So we really see Isleas Park as the green, resilient, and industrial heart for this part of the city.
So I'll talk a bit about the South Bay design opportunity that we have. And of course, we call it South Bay living because we think that South Bay is known for many things, but not really for living. If you can even afford it, it's not good for living. It's for traffic jams, it's for Silicon Valley, it's for inequity and all these things. One of the things of the South Bay is that you see many of the urban stresses coming together in the South Bay, and those will be compounded by climate-related stresses that come from sea level rise. And we feel that it's very difficult to address these stresses so far, in part because of the sort of atomized way in which the Bay has organized itself. So what we think and what we want to propose is a sort of systems perspective on the South Bay, which maybe starts with thinking about mobility and transit, where you see that it's really car-oriented. A Caltrain comes there, but hardly anyone ever uses it, which is logical because there's no way to get from the stations to the different working places that are there. And that's why even big ideas, which we all enthusiastically work on, specifically Jeremy and his firm like the Hyperloop, are the things that we don't think are opportune here. We think that, especially given the innovative culture that is there, you might really look at developments in mobility technology, and you might want to look at the existing assets that are there, the trails, the highways, maybe even the ferries. So we think that if you want to approach mobility, you might want to start thinking, can we activate these trails for e-bike mobility? Can we start to think how then these e-bikes could sort of connect both to the uplands, to the different workplaces, but also maybe to a ferry-related system. This ferry boat, of course, is too big and will have difficulty getting into the South Bay, but you can imagine that in the future, especially with sea level rise, there's whole new sets of ferry technologies that can actually work very well there. A sort of second component of that mobility strategy would be to rethink the highways which are now big arteries, clogged arteries through the South Bay. This is another black screen. And that image would have shown you a BRT system. And maybe we don't want to show a BRT system because we built on it, but we also think that it can be rethought into the future. Bus rapid transits can maybe be implemented on the highways, and with the advent of new car technology can become vehicle rapid transit with stations on the highway, which could be connected to developments on either side of the highway. A sort of second component of that thinking is once you start to think about how can we use these developments in vehicle technology, you start to look differently at these parking places that are now both large swaths of impervious surfaces that might not be needed in the future because the mobility changes. So you can really think maybe we can densify them at parts, we can build other programs there, and at the same time green them and create spaces for water there, so that we really make the let's say gray grid into what you could call a green grid. And we made the calculations there and figured out that more than 500,000 dwellings plus a lot of jobs could be done at a relatively modest height. And that sort of brings, if you link those two systems together, you can really start to think about a densification strategy in the South Bay. To which a third element, the ponds, could be fantastic assets. These ponds, and people have talked about it, are what we think will not function in the long term as a nature system, as a natural system. They've never really been that, so we think that they should really be explored as a constructed environment with a lot of different functions that they could have. Ponds could be there for algae production. They could be used as batteries. They can be used to retain stormwater. They can do solar. And in the end, once you start thinking about that, you can start thinking about floating villages there that in themselves can also start to become interesting elements for innovations where you sort of link these systems together on a sort of smaller scale. And we feel that as we talk to the people in those areas and we understand their stresses, but we also understand their forward trajectories, that there's really a project there, a project that not only works to create a lot of housing, a different view on mobility, but which can also give a different sort of signature on the bay. I'm going to let these films roll and give it to Jeremy.
So imagining, as Matthijs said, not only infrastructural functions, but also living at the edge. And I know we're out of time, so I'll just close by saying that for us, climate change, actually, there's here kind of everything just coming together as one system. So I'll just close by saying that for us, climate change adaptation is about solving problems, but in the end, it's also an incredible opportunity to make places better. So whether it's South Bay having a new kind of appeal on par with South Florida, or a new green resilient heart for Isleas Park, we really see opportunities in the Bay to rediscover nature, to rediscover all of the systems that have been kind of disconnected from one another, and create a better place to live. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So we're really excited now that we've seen all these incredible ideas to share them with the public tonight and share them broadly. So one logistical issue, if your video that you submitted has a private setting, please make sure that you switch it to public as soon as possible, because those are going to be connected to our Neighborland site so people can see them. So anyway, that's just, presumably you know who you are if you're the person who does that on your team. So please go check that out, or ask Zoe if you have any questions, or Emma. And then we saw lots of great social media posts today, letting people know about this. I think we'll be pushing this out to our lists and throughout our network, and would ask teams to share as well throughout this comment period to let people know. We want to get lots of feedback from these initial ideas. I think we're really trying hard to make sure people understand that this is the beginning of a conversation, that we're really excited to bring more people into the process throughout the design phase once sites are identified. So getting that early feedback from people throughout cities, counties, community organizations, and other residents about what they're excited about, what they'd like to be involved in, is going to be really important. So we'd love to see your channels push those out as well. And then with that, I just, again, want to thank my staff for all the work that they've done throughout this whole time. It's really an incredible team, they've been asked to move mountains, and they have, so we're really excited to celebrate with you tonight and share this with the public.